Was Cormac McCarthy a Christian? Well, this is actually a complex problem. And McCarthy's path through Christianity and spirituality actually mimics, I would say, a lot of our journey with the dark arts of religion and spirituality. So, Cormac was raised Catholic, and his parents were very religious. I've read accounts that they were weekly churchgoers for their entire life. And McCarthy went to Catholic school. And that brings us to the first and one of the only statements Cormac has made about his childhood. And he said, when asked to reflect on his time at Catholic school, that the nuns had nothing to teach him. And this aligns with Cormac's rebellious personality in high school because he was the jokester, the very talented, smart kid who really didn't try very hard. You could compare him to like a Ferris Bueller. And the constraints of not just the school, but the expectations that his parents had because of his high achieving sisters really weighed down on McCarthy. And I think this is where his first rejections of the Christian doctrine start to take place. And from what I can tell, this wasn't a instant journey into atheism by McCarthy. And I'm going to explain Christianity in his novels in a second, but seeds of doubt were starting to fester in McCarthy's mind about religion and whatnot and at Catholic school. But he moved on to university and didn't feel fulfilled for his first 2 years at the University of Tennessee. So he shipped himself off to the Air Force. And while up in Alaska, he started to read seriously for the very first time. And I think this is where McCarthy broke into atheism for the first time because he started to confront the real thinkers of existentialism and atheism who were actually gaining some traction at that time because this is the early 1950s. McCarthy around this time also read Dostoevsky, which is such an enigma with these questions because he is so dyadic. And that's, just as a spoiler alert, how I think Cormac McCarthy exists with religion and his own spirituality. So when McCarthy writes, and so this is very common, right? I went through something similar. You're raised Christian and then you become an atheist, right? You start reading these kind of radical thinkers, the Russians, the French, and you're like, oh my God, this is all not true. I was lied to. And then suddenly you're an atheist, but then you're in this blissful state where you're living in objectivity. And I think McCarthy existed in this state all the way up, and this is getting crazy, until the time that he was writing Sentry, until after Child of God. Because hear me out here. In The Orchard Keeper, McCarthy created too complex and layered of a novel for a modern audience. He had that sort of atheistic superiority where he felt like kind of like a lit bro that he had to project all of his greatness onto this book and people would understand it. And he felt disappointed when no one did. And so when he transitioned to Outer Dark, he wanted to write something a little bit more simple and more symbolic. I mean, this is from an objective point of view, a very good idea. I'm going to make a story that has some darkness in it, but I'm going to kind of touch the unconscious a little bit more. And Outer Dark was obviously inspired by his divorce. It's his Eraserhead, as I've talked about on the show many times. And the main symbolic aspect of Outer Dark is the triune, is the Trinity, the three men. I mean, spoiler alert. And three is always a big thing in, thought, emotion, action, the triangle in all of like symbolism in history. And it could be debated in Outer Dark if McCarthy is either talking about the Christian Trinity or id, ego, and superego, which also kind of represent the Trinity. But nonetheless, in McCarthy's work, starting really in Outer Dark, he starts to play with Gnosticism. And in the Cormac McCarthy Substack, I'm building up some videos on Cormac McCarthy and Gnosticism. It's actually such a rabbit hole that is one of the more meta McCarthy aspects of his work because the whole Gnostic pantheon and knowledge space is also just very meta. And so anyway, in Gnosticism, it's believed that there's this demiurge God, the Christian God, you could say, is this lower being who's created a world of illusion and darkness. And that's what we're living in right now. Sounds very familiar to a Cormac McCarthy novel. And McCarthy knew about Gnosticism. And when you read a lot of the academic accounts of Gnosticism in McCarthy's work, he is purposely putting symbols and Gnostic ideas into his work. But Gnosticism is an early branch of Christianity, but in modern terms, it's not considered Christianity at all. And so to kind of explore the question, I think this is where the discussion of is Cormac McCarthy a Christian ends because the only type of Christian he could be is a Gnostic, judging from what he's talked about and what he's written about. And that's not considered Christianity, and I also really don't think he considers himself a Gnostic. It's just once again a very deep and symbolic thing he can embed in the text to just make it better. When you spend 7 years on something and you're just revising it ad infinitum, you can just add layers upon layers of contrast within it. So 50 years later, some random YouTuber is still talking about you. And so when we transition to child of God, I think that that is more of like the nihilistic and atheistic like pinnacle of McCarthy's career. And in McCarthy's life at this time, things were not going good. During Outer Dark and during Child of God, he had been divorced and he was living for part of it during the most depressed time of his life. He was single for a couple years, moping around, like very depressed, not eating Thanksgiving alone and journaling about it and crying about it, which sucks. His wife had left with his kid, his son, to Wyoming. And so when we transition to Sentry, something happens during this time period. In 1974, he has writer's block in terms of finishing Sentry. So he divorces, leaves his second wife, says, "See you later, lady." He takes her out on her birthday at the best restaurant in the city and then leaves her the next day. Very gentlemanly move. Moves to Tucson. And this is actually during this time period where he really discovers and starts to explore physics and mathematics at a deep level. Maybe not for the first time, but like I said, he now that he, because with Annie Delisle, his second wife, he was a socialite. He would wake up and be working on their house during the morning and hanging out with her. And then he would write for 4 or 5 hours. And most nights of the week, they were hanging out with other people, going to parties. Like, it was a very active lifestyle. There really wasn't that time there to be like doing what he wanted to do, which was traveling around and researching things, and kind of what he did for the last couple decades of his life. And so when we look at when we look at what happens with Sentry, I think the breakthroughs that Cormac makes is in the quantum realm. And I want to pull a quote here before we get into this about Cormac McCarthy and atheism. And in Stella Maris, the therapist asks Alicia, "Do you think of yourself as an atheist?" And Alicia answers, "God, no. Those were the good old days." And once again, kind of returning to us, I know so many people with a very similar experience. You leave religion forever, you become an atheist, but there's something missing. And then eventually you move into the unknown. And I think this is because McCarthy tapped into the quantum realm, because around this time, and even all the way up until today, quantum physics has been a big thing. And I know there's been a lot of connection to quantum physics in like a very pop way to like Eastern philosophy and whatnot. But there is a real connection there. And like the Taoists and the Buddhists and the yogis, the Hindus, they were understanding some of the philosophical aspects of quantum physics and quantum realities 2,000 years ago. Christianity needed Francis Bacon and science and the Industrial Revolution to figure it all out and put it right in front of us so that we could believe it. But a lot of the ideas had been being explored for a long time. And Sentry is really more of a Taoist, a Buddhist, a rambler. You could even view him as McCarthy's ode to a more Jack Kerouac or Gary Snyder character in Dharma Bums. Even though like a lot of the lightheartedness isn't there, that's because McCarthy has crazy prose and likes to write like he's in a fever dream. But a lot of the characterization or attempted characterization and growth that Sentry tries to make is not really from a Christian point of view. It's from more of an Eastern point of view. And I think this is an encapsulation of what McCarthy's personal freedom and liberation was looking like at the time. Because as I've talked about before, in the early drafts of Sentry, Cornelius Sentry was much more vocal, was much more emotive, was stating opinions, and eventually McCarthy dwindled that down and made him more of this minimalist character. And that is once again more akin to the Eastern tradition, to Chinese poetry. We have Robert Lowell and Walt Whitman in the American poetry canon. But then when you have people like Cold Mountain, Tu Fu, Li Po, Tao Qian, all those guys in the Chinese tradition who just write about nature and just add a little contrast. The heron cries into the night. It's a totally different world when it comes to literature. And from what I can tell, especially from what he was reading in the archive around this time, Eastern philosophy and physics was starting to become a much bigger deal. And so back to like spirituality and Cormac being a Christian, I think this is where he breaks from Christianity in general forever, because a lot of people who get stuck in that dialect. So if I'm a Christian, right, I grew up and I'm a Christian, and then I reject it, I'm still in the dialect of Christianity. Like a lot of these atheists, like, because I used to I went to university in Utah, And I would go, and everyone at Utah never figured this out. Like I knew all these people and they were rejecting Mormonism and Christianity. But I was always like, you guys are just the other side of the coin because you've rejected this, but you haven't grown and become something more. Your whole identity is not being that, which still makes you that. And for Westerners, like most of the time, it is through the East that we find that liberation because all the knight errantry and all, I mean, Carl Jung would disagree. And this is a Carl Jung channel also. Carl Jung would say that all the knight errantry stuff and all that stuff was actually good for us. And we need to return to that. That shutting out and meditating and doing all that is bad for us. But let's not get meta Jungian here. Anyway, around this time is when McCarthy breaks from Christianity for good. But it's interesting because Blood Meridian, a lot of people see this as a Christian parable. Here, let's go to the Cormac McCarthy subreddit. Shout out to the mod who won't approve or let me post any of my things on the subreddit. And at least once a week, you see a post about how, comparing Judge Holden to Lucifer, the Christian version of Lucifer. However, with Blood Meridian, this is what I think happened. It is when McCarthy got to the top of the mountain because McCarthy consciously started to dwindle down his prose after Blood Meridian. Like, the Border Trilogy, No Country for Old Men, The Road. Everyone's like, I love them. But he is dialing it back. Like, he does have these moments. But what he does in Blood Meridian is almost like he's standing at the top of the mountain and saying down to everyone, I understand all this now. I know that. And that's almost personified to the egoic character of Judge Holden. But I'm making a video right now for the Cormac McCarthy Substack on, like, the Freemasonic symbolism within Blood Meridian. There is Gnostic symbolism, Christian symbolism, Freemasonic symbolism, the tarot symbolism, indigenous symbolism. There's like all this stuff that has been layered in. And it's somewhat ridiculous because the average person reading the novel is not really getting any benefit from it, like even at an unconscious level. Because if you're not like an initiate into Freemasonry, or like it's not really working on that level. I guess at some level it is. But McCarthy, who at the time while writing it, was in his early 40s to late 40s, I think felt at the peak of his life. He said in his 1992 interview with Rick Wallach that he quit drinking with one of his young girlfriends. He now has money from the MacArthur Fellowship, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is akin to almost $1 million today. He's got young girlfriends. He's away from all of his wives who are nagging him about money all the time. And he is peaking as a writer, as a thinker. He has now reached the top of the mountain. And once again, this is very similar. This happens all of the time. And you could say this is the peak of a life. Like in the Chinese tradition, for the higher class back in the day, you would work and like achieve greatness in your life. And then like a lot of the great Chinese poets were once like administrators and people in society. And then they would leave. They leave their family and wives and go write poetry in the woods for a couple decades. And so they made a conscious transition to minimalism at the end of their life. And so when I'm looking at what happens after all of this, Cormac actually gets into a more contemplative zone, but not in his novels. In the Border Trilogy, in The Crossing, he does play with the idea of God a little bit. And it's kind of the idea of this mixed God. So let's talk about something. So in The Sunset Limited, right? Like returning to The Sunset Limited, we have black and white. And it's like probably one of the most, if you want to read something and understand Cormac's views on religion, it's kind of there. And Cormac recently in his interview with Lawrence Krauss, when he was asked about his religion, he said, I'm mostly a materialist. And what is that part of him that isn't a materialist? He echoes this in the Oprah interview when she asked, do you believe in God? And he says, some days I do. And this is an idea that he got from Dostoevsky. Sorry, everyone, I mispronounce that all the time. So I'm trying to be better every single time in the comments. Like, you're mispronouncing it wrong. I probably still am. And in the Brothers Karamazov, which actually a new translation for any fans, there a new translation just got released like a month ago and very good. I read it over the past month or so, would highly recommend. But black and white are similar to Ivan and Father Zosima, however we want to say that. And it's interesting that Dostoevsky was influential not just to McCarthy, but Wittgenstein, to Nietzsche, and many other people who like to explore the question about, in the sense from Dostoevsky, how an educated person can come to God, to believe in God, especially like in this modern world, because that's what ended up happening to Dostoevsky. He returned to God at like a much more extreme level after, his imprisonment and whatnot. And I think McCarthy is also very sympathetic to religious experience, because he actually recommended the varieties of religious experience in that kind. I can't remember the novel, but he was hanging out with a guy, and the guy wrote a chapter in a book about like his discussions with Cormac, and Cormac has had that book listed in the archive and has recommended that a lot. He took LSD, and I think that he was interested in religious experiences because they are, you could say, objective. I've had some, like most people, if you tried to have a religious experience, whether it be through meditation, God, drugs, like whatever, you'll get one. Eventually, you're going to find one. And once again, I think that this, it really kind of shows the quantum realm. And another random thing, and this just came to my mind. I should have mentioned this earlier. That's like every single video. I'm like, make bullet points, Ian, but I never do. I say this all the time. Cormac McCarthy was the lineage holder of the King James Bible, and probably is the last one. He wrote in the King James style better than anyone, and I don't know how he accomplished that other than a deep knowledge of the Bible, or just through his love of Christian writers and the canon and being raised Catholic. And he just had this kind of very great natural talent to be able to do that. Or, and that really comes out in Blood Meridian. Like I say that all the time, but the King James prose is present in Blood Meridian and a little bit in Sentry, like, at times in Sentry. And so that could just be a conscious choice of him trying to be magnanimous, just another meta thing that he's trying to do. I don't really have a great opinion on that. I'm also running on like 4 hours of sleep right now, so I'm probably not in the zone to be able to drop knowledge on that. So if anyone down below wants to give further explication on that, go ahead. Another thing that's interesting, in The Passenger and Stella Maris, like Jewish culture and Jewish identity was actually kind of a big thing. At one point, Bobby is like looking in the phone book and calls, I think, someone named Klein because he says, I looked like your name was Jewish. And so Bobby and Alicia are Jewish, but at one point Bobby goes to a cathedral and is like doing stuff there. So there's also that confliction happening there. And I think that's what I think, moving back, was what is happening to McCarthy. That I don't know what the other side of the dyad is, but I think it isn't Christianity. I think one side is more of like an Eastern agnostic view of spirituality that's rooted in and has a base in Christianity, Judaism, and like obviously all of that because it's the most influential part of our consciousness. But the other side is more of the atheistic, fatalistic, materialistic side of McCarthy. And to conclude and connect this to philosophy, I would assume that McCarthy, if he is anything, is more of a Spinozian. That, seems to make the most amount of sense in regard, because I can't tell how deep he went into Eastern philosophy and left really the tradition of the West. My camera just went out, so we will end it there, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.